In 1949, Harry Truman gave most of the world a new name: underdeveloped. Not colonized, not deliberately impoverished, underdeveloped. Technically behind. A gap that capital and advice could fill, right? 75 years later, 137 countries still carry the updated version of that label. And some of these countries have grown multiple folds over that time period. Some have gone on to do amazing things, and yet they're still developing. And so if you're like me, who studies development, and I have been now for over, say, a decade, then you know how difficult it is to define what development means, to find a suitable, generally acceptable definition for development. And the reason for that is because that categorization was never just a description, it was a verdict. So it's pretty difficult to graduate from a verdict, right? So if a country is developing, it might just mean that they will continue to develop forever. Hi, I'm Tochi Victor, and this is the Tochi Victor Show, where I put Africa at the center of global economic conversations. Quite seriously, actually. And let's get into it. So the word development is at the moment doing an enormous amount of work in the world right now. It essentially determines which countries get loans, on what terms. It decides which governments get praise for whatever it is they're doing in terms of their monetary policies, fiscal policies, and which ones get lectured, right? It does shape how billions, trillions of dollars flow across borders across the world. And development has become the organizing concept of an entire global industry, one with its own set of institutions, its own language, its own internal logic. And almost nobody stops to ask how this work came about, who invented it, what gave it its current meaning, what set of conditions allow it to continue to exist in its current form, and who benefits from keeping it in place, right? And mind you, the word is not neutral. Development is not neutral. It never was. To get a better sense of this, you have to go back to January 20th of 1949, Harry Truman's inaugural address being sworn in as the President of the United States of America. Most people remember the speech for its Cold War framing. It's America versus the Soviet Union, it's democracy and capitalism versus communism. And Harry Truman gave essentially a verdict about how the United States was going to deal with the rest of the world. And he had 4 points. He had a 4-point agenda. And the fourth point of that speech was a sentence that would quietly reshape the entire global order, right? Truman called on the United States to make its scientific and industrial progress available to, and I'm quoting directly from his speech, to underdeveloped areas of the world. And it was the first time, actually, that a sitting US president had used the word to describe most of humanity. And with it, Truman accomplished something that centuries of colonial language had not done, or not quite managed to do. He converted a civilizational judgment into an economic category. It wasn't a racial claim, and it was also not a moral claim. It was an economic one, which meant that these countries were not necessarily inferior to the United States of America. They were just behind in their development process. And all they needed to do was catch up. And if the United States could provide its technology, its capital, and its goodwill, and its advice, then all of these countries would just catch up, right? It wasn't until much later when Arturo Escobar, actually in the mid-90s, tried to explain what Truman was actually trying to say, right? And he was one of the first scholars to do this. And by the way, Arturo Escobar is a Colombian anthropologist. And he argued that what Truman did in 1949 was not a speech. It was the founding moment of a new regime of knowledge, one that divided the entire world into developed and underdeveloped and placed Western industrial capitalism at the apex of human progress and positioned every other form of economic life as a deficit waiting to be filled by this Western industrial capitalism. Now, you go back to the founding of the World Bank at Bretton Woods in 1944, and you combine that with the Truman Doctrine. And the World Bank essentially then had a clear mandate, which was to lend to underdeveloped nations to help them industrialize. The International Monetary Fund was also born at Bretton Woods and would essentially become the institution that manages the monetary conditions of the entire lending process to the underdeveloped parts of the world to help them industrialize. And there were a set of institutions like the USAID that followed in 1961, created by Jeff Kennedy. And the goal of the USAID became to coordinate American foreign development assistance to the rest of the world. And then you had the United Nations Development Program, which was created in 1965, to then become the boots on the ground. We're going to be on the ground to actually see that this happens. And what you saw was within 20 years of Truman's speech, the modern development industry was fully operational. We had thousands of economists, consultants, organizations, all organized around this simple premise that the problem of poverty was a technical problem and that technical experts from developed countries could provide all of the solutions. With some advice, with some technical assistance, all these developing countries, they could get it right. Now, Walter Rodney, a Guyanese historian and activist, and in 1972 published what remains one of the most important books ever written about Africa's economic position, titled How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And Rodney's point was precise in that he argued that Africa did not arrive at the 20th century underdeveloped, as Truman stated. Africa was made underdeveloped through 3 to 4 centuries of the slave trade that extracted capital at a scale that has never been fully reckoned with even today. And then through colonialism, which reorganized African economies to produce raw materials for European factories while deliberately suppressing local industry and institutions. So the word underdeveloped implied a certain condition, and Rodney showed that it was actually a produced condition. It was a result, not a baseline. And if you believe the first, Africa simply hasn't developed yet, then development assistance becomes a gift. It's something you receive with open arms, with joy, with a smile on your face. If you believe the second, that Africa was actively prevented from developing, then development assistance begins to look like a settlement offer. You know what? We deserve this. We should get it, and we must get it, right? The claim that I want to make here with this episode is that developing is not a description of a trajectory. It is a structural position in the global economy. Countries don't graduate from it because the system is not designed for graduation. And the way that has played out the last 6 decades or so is that the definition of what development means continues to change, right? In the 1960s, development simply meant industrialization. So you build factories, you grow manufacturing, you essentially replicate what Europe and America did in the 19th century, and that was development. In the 70s, that definition shifted a little bit. Development now meant a set of basic needs like clean water, healthcare, nutrition. Then in the 80s, and this was one of the craziest times in economic history, this was Ronald Reagan, this was Margaret Thatcher, and essentially the definition of development was rewritten again to mean structural adjustment, that African governments needed to cut government spending, they needed to liberalize trade, they needed to privatize state enterprises and reduce state interference. And voila, you got a growing economy. All of this obviously was subsumed into a blueprint in 1981. The Berg report by the World Bank titled Accelerated Development in Sub-Saharan Africa, and it argued for structural adjustment, that African governments were the problem and that markets needed to be freed from state interference, and that was the solution. Then by the 90s, the new definition of development was all about good governance, and nobody could really define what good governance meant. Was it about institutions? Was it about trade? Was it about politics? Nobody really could define what good governance meant in the late 1990s. And then by the early 2000s, we had the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, 8 specific targets, 18 indicators. By the 2010s, it was the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, 17 goals, 169 targets. And so every decade, we've seen a new framework that looks to redefine what development means. And every time African economies approached one set of benchmarks, a new set appeared. It was, oh, yeah, here's the goalpost. You're getting close. Oh, we have to move. Or maybe they don't even get close at all, and it just keeps changing. Having said that, I don't think that all of that was conspiracy, right? I actually think it definitely reflected a genuine evolution in economic thinking because all of this was happening in multiple contexts. There were things happening globally. We could go back to the financial crises in the 90s, in 2008, the dot-com bust. You go back to the fluctuation in oil prices in the 80s, the wars, and there was just so many things. The Cold War, World War II, so many things happening. And all of this were happening as the world was changing. So I honestly don't think that there was a conspiracy to always redefine what development means to keep this going and all of that. It's really about just an evolution in economic thinking. I think that was what was happening. Now, but whatever the intention was, it just means that the definition and the destination of developed is perpetually and structurally just out of reach. The second dimension of this is harder to say, but important to say pretty clearly, which is that the development industry, made up of all of the institutions, think about the ones that comes to mind, the World Bank, the IMF, bilateral donors, the global NGO sector, they all have structural incentives to maintain the conditions that they claim to address, right? And William Easterly, who was a former World Bank researcher, made his argument in 2006 about the white man's burden, where he distinguished between what he called planners and searchers, right? Planners being the institutions that design top to down solutions without accountability to the people they serve. And then searchers being the ones, practitioners who find what actually works on the ground and try to scale that solution. And his argument was that the entire institutional architecture of international development is built around planners, and that needed to change. And it needed to change because these people could not get fired, even if their programs were not yielding the outcomes on the ground for the communities that they were trying to serve. And the reason for that is because they're not answerable to the aid recipients, right? They're only answerable to people who provide the funds. And so some of these arguments have been postulated by some of the top economists in development. And one of those, again, is Zambian economist Dambisa Moyo, who took that further with her book in 2009 called Dead Aid, where she argued that aid doesn't just fail to produce development, it actually prevents it, right? By creating dependency structures, by crowding out local capital markets, by allowing African governments to fund themselves through donor relationships rather than building domestic tax bases that allow them to actually build real accountability structures for their citizenry. And all of these arguments are still contested till today. Not everyone agrees with Moyo or Easterly, and the evidence on specific aid programs is more mixed than either of them would suggest. But the aggregate record of the last 50 years of development finance, I think, just needs to be litigated structurally rather than through policy. And that's because all of the countries that have been receiving all of this aid, most of them are still developing. And so you have to say, why is that the case? Maybe all of this money is not being put to good use. The third dimension is the deepest, and it comes from Amartya Sen. Amartya Sen is a Nobel Prize economist and probably one of my favorite. But in 1999, Sen published Development as Freedom. And his argument was this. And he said that development is not economic growth. And this was a game changer for a lot of people in terms of how we think about development. That development is not economic growth. Development is the expansion of human freedom. The freedom to live a long and healthy life, to be educated, to participate in public and political life, to exercise real choices about how you live. And by the way, GDP growth is one input into that process. It is not the process itself. So essentially, what that means is that a country can grow its GDP while most of its citizens get poorer. A country can have a high GDP per capita and still imprison its journalists, still stifle human rights, free speech, all of these things that matter to people in terms of how they make choices and how they choose to go about living their lives. So economic growth and human development are not the same thing, and treating them as the same, which the Bretton Woods architecture does, is a foundational conceptual error. That was Amartya Sen's argument. But again, like every sort of development framework that tries to define what development means, no framework is complete. And Amartya Sen's framework also had limits because it was not being defined in African policymaking offices in Africa or other parts of the developing world. These were still being defined in the US, in some of these institutions like Harvard and Cambridge, right? And that was what Arturo Escobar was trying to litigate and complain about when he said, look, development was and continues to be, for the most part, a top-down, ethnocentric, and technocratic approach that treats people and cultures as abstract concepts, statistical figures, to be moved up and down in the charts of progress. But all of these people in the post-development school, Escobar, Wolfgang Sachs, and the likes of Gustavo Esteva, they're not saying, hey, you know what, let's leave people in poverty. They're not arguing to allow people to continue to suffer in poverty, right? They're arguing that the language and the institutions of development have colonized the imagination so completely that it has become almost impossible to think about human flourishing in terms that don't map back to Western capitalism, which means that the most intellectual act available, especially to African economists or African policymakers, is not a better development policy, so to speak, but maybe an entirely different question, right? So, what does African economists, African policymakers, African government, what do they do with this? And if developing is a political construction that was invented to serve political interests, administered by institutions with structural reasons to maintain rather than resolve the problem, then what should African governments, economists, citizens actually do? The first thing is to interrogate the metrics, right? GDP, as we know, is the single most cited number in global economic discourse. It was designed by Simon Kuznets in 1934 to track American wartime industrial production. Kuznets himself, in his first report to the US Senate, warned explicitly that it should not be used as a measure of welfare because the GDP itself as a measurement has changed over the years. But in its construct, an oil spill cleanup would count as economic growth. You would count a car accident as economic growth because the hospital bills, the legal fees, the insurance claims all add up. They add into the measure of GDP as economic growth. But also, it doesn't measure things like unpaid domestic labor. It doesn't count whether people trust their neighbors or their government. It doesn't measure any sort of happiness in the economy. And so it's incomplete. But if you think about it, the whole point of economics is to model reality. And so it's unrealistic to think that the GDP as a measurement of economic growth is supposed to be all encompassing, right? So again, that speaks to its limitation. But it's a measurement that gets talked about quite a lot. And people mistake it for a comprehensive view of the economy in terms of how people are doing, their well-being, their welfare, and all of that, which should not be the case. So when the International Monetary Fund, for instance, tells an African government that it needs to improve its economic fundamentals, it is speaking in the language of a measurement tool that is designed decades ago and not adequate for measuring every aspect of human welfare today. The second thing is to engage the development institutions with open eyes, right? Not to disengage from them. That is not the point, right? You cannot disengage from the World Banks, the IMFs of the world, the African Development Banks of the world. The reason is just because they do control access to capital markets. They influence sovereign credit ratings. They shape the conditions under which billions and trillions of dollars move across borders, right? So engagement is not optional, but you have to engage with open eyes. And you have to engage knowing that there are costs to certain measures, right? Measures like structural adjustment had consequential costs for the economy. And a lot of countries arguably have not recovered from structural adjustment programs in the 1980s to date. So you have to engage knowing that all of these institutions on the other side of the table, they all have their own organizational interests, their own ideological histories, their own definition of what a successful country looks like. And knowing all of this is probably the minimum requirement for being able to negotiate on your own terms. So here's my opine, right? I think the most intellectual work happening in Africa right now is not economic policy design. It is the slower, more difficult project of writing a different story for what prosperity means for the African continent and maybe the individual countries on the African continent. There are frameworks that are beginning to emerge that try to do this seriously. Ubuntu economics is one of them. The argument that human flourishing is fundamentally a communal challenge, not an individual one, and that economic organization should reflect that. There's also the African Union Agenda of 2063, which is not perfect, but at least attempts to define Africa's trajectory on African terms. And I think that's great, even though it still borrows from a lot. It borrows a lot from the SDG framework. But none of these frameworks are perfect. None of them are ready, I don't think, to replace the Bretton Woods architecture. But I believe they're asking the right questions, which is what are we trying to develop into? And here's what I actually believe. The category of developing is not going to go away through better policy implementation. It's not. It is not going to go away because African governments all of a sudden start to meet the next set of SDG targets. It is not going to dissolve because a messiah comes and starts to do things differently. It's going to go away once African economists, policymakers, and citizens decide to refuse the category entirely, right? Stop asking, how do we develop? And start asking, develop into what? At what cost? On whose terms? And for whose benefit? I don't think African governments are asking that question. And that's why you're going to have the situation of the Congo. You're going to have the problem of the Niger Delta in Nigeria, where oil is just being extracted. The communities are not flourishing. You're going to continue to have the South African condition. You're going to have, you go to Kenya, East Africa, West Africa, all over, just even in the north with Algeria, all of these places, Somalia, Sudan. But I think that increasingly that question is being asked now, and people are getting louder. Young people are speaking up, and more than any policy framework, I think changing the question is what is going to seriously redefine what development means for the African continent in the next 50 years, and maybe help the continent even achieve the 2063 agenda of the African Union. So in closing, I would say that there are three things I want to leave you with. One, developing country as a political category was invented, right? In 1949, you could say. It positions Western industrial capitalism as the universal destination of human progress and has organized billions of dollars of policy and finance ever since. The second is that the development industry has structural incentives to maintain the conditions it claims to address. And until this is solved institutionally, I don't think there's any way forward, right? This is not a moral judgment on the people who are in development, like myself. It is just an observation of how institutions work. So you have to judge development programs on their outcomes, specifically on the outcomes for people who had no say in the program's design in the first place. Third is that the most important question, like I just said, in African economics right now is not how do we develop. There has been a question for years, and there's so many prescriptions for how you develop. But that is not the right question. The right question is, what are you developing into and on whose terms? And I think that question, like I said, is being asked with increasing seriousness. And that is the direction that we're going to take here on the show. And so next time around, I'll talk about GDP, what it means, where it came from, and we'll see how well it does with helping us measure welfare today, and maybe in combination with other measurements, and see how African economies are trying to measure the welfare of their people. I'm Victor Tochi. This is the Tochi Victor Show. Think on it. I will see you the next time.